In the dim corridors behind power and fear, the phrase "the quiet godfather of the American Mafia" evokes a figure who commands dominion not by thunderous proclamations or public spectacle, but through a still, implacable aura. Influence and secrecy intertwine as twin pillars of his reign. Influence reaches outward, bending wills, shifting allegiances, and remaking destinies. Secrecy retreats inward, a hushed fortress surrounding his being, guarding vulnerabilities and concealing machinations from both friends and foes. Influence is the whispered weight of his presence in rooms he never enters, a mere nod in private conversations, a discreet request made behind closed doors, a suggestion sprung in the ear of a politician or a policeman. Each carries more force than open threats. His domain is woven into the sinews of communities, labor unions, local businesses, municipal offices, courts, even churches. His name need not be spoken. Its echo settles in hearts and minds, inducing compliance without overt coercion. Where others storm and shout, he works through networks, favors, debts, and reciprocity. The value of a gift, the obligation incurred, the memory of a kindness or a slight, these are his currency. He understands that power is best exercised by letting others believe they chose it. By owning the backdrop of their choices, he molds events with the softest pressure, leaving the impression that chance or fortune directed outcomes. His influence is durable because it is subtle. It survives denials, evades exposure, and resists reversal. Secrecy is the sanctuary from which his empire is built. In darkness, one hides not only deeds but intents, so that no adversary can predict the next move. His true reach, his deepest fears, the internal conflicts among his lieutenants all remain veiled. Only the rare few enter that sanctum, and only when they have earned a permanent place in its shifting geometry. He exchanges no confidences, he prevents leaks before they occur. Secrets are not just hidden, they are unspoken, never recorded, the silent agreement that some gates remain forever locked, their keys lost or destroyed. In this realm, betrayal is unthinkable, for without loyalty there is no structure, and betrayal must be extinguished before it is even conceived. Trust is earned in blood and in silence. These two qualities feed one another. Influence without secrecy becomes exposure, vulnerability, the ID that can be attacked. Secrecy without influence becomes emptiness, impotence. Together they birth an empire that lives in shadows but commands the daylight. He does not draw attention, for attention brings scrutiny, and scrutiny unravels. Instead, he prefers to be the hand behind the curtain, pulling strings that glint only momentarily before vanishing again. The loyal observe that his face is seldom seen in confrontations, his name seldom used in public debates, yet his will is felt everywhere, in the tremor of decisions made far from his throne. In embodying those twin pillars, the quiet godfather becomes more than a criminal overlord. He becomes a phenomenon, a moral and political metaphor. He channels the ancient traditions of omerta, the code of silence that forbids cooperation with outside forces, no matter injury or pressure. Wikipedia in the dim world where law and order often fail, he becomes the arbiter, protector, punisher, a shadow alternative to the state. To the communities that find themselves marginalized or threatened, he appears as both bulwark and tyrant, dispensing brutal justice but also providing stability, order, even a skewed form of fairness. In that inversion lies the irony. In opposing the law, he sometimes acts as a de facto sovereign of the powerless. In imagining this figure, one senses echoes of Don Vito Corleone, whose reign in The Godfather rested not on flashy gangland theatrics, but on timeless precepts of honor, obligation, and the soft tyranny of paternal authority. Encyclopedia +2 Chronicles +2 He met requests with favors, weighed debts not just in money but in dignity. He refused outright domination in some endeavors. For instance, the narcotics trade, not out of moral scruple, but because he knew that certain alliances would unravel the fragile balance he had long cultivated. Time +1 He performed violence, but rarely ostentatiously. The dread he inspired often preceded the act itself. To dwell on influence and secrecy is also to glimpse the fate of such power. For influence must be renewed constantly, loyalty must be sustained, rivals must be silenced before they speak, and the state's instruments of law, when awakened, are dangerous. Secrecy is brittle. A single leak or defection can expose everything. So the quiet godfather must remain ever vigilant, ever poised between assertion and withdrawal. His empire is a house of cards built in darkness, requiring perpetual maintenance. When the light shines too brightly through inquiry, whistleblowers, betrayal, the grandeur cracks, and hidden foundations tremble. Yet in his best moments he presides over a strange continuity, institutions that sanction his presence, figures that perpetuate his legacy, families that carry his name and methods long after his bones have turned to dust. His ideal is not personal immortality, but the extension of his method, the stealthy grip of influence, the impervious shield of secrecy as norms in every sector of power. In that way, the quiet godfather is a force that transcends the individual. He becomes a whisper in the architecture of governance itself, a ghost in the machinery of coercion, a shadow in the edifice of authority. To conjure his portrait is to reckon with the paradox that true power often shuns spectacle. Influence is precious when it unites persuasion and obedience. Secrecy is essential when it hides strategy and weakness. He is quiet not because he lacks might, but because he understands that the mightiest rule is the one no one sees coming. He didn't need to speak loudly to be heard. In fact, the more silent he was, the more the room bent toward his presence. That's the paradox of real power. It doesn't scream, it doesn't boast, it doesn't need to stand in the spotlight. Real power sits quietly at the back of the room, watching everything, saying nothing, and controlling everyone. That was the quiet godfather, a man whose name wasn't plastered across headlines, who didn't chase fame or attention. He wasn't the type you saw doing interviews or parading around in flashy suits. But if you understood the street, if you had half a brain in the underworld, you knew he was the architect behind the architecture, the one who never had to raise his voice because everyone already understood what silence meant. Influence in his world was a quiet thing, a soft pressure, a nod, a look, a name whispered behind closed doors. It wasn't about yelling in someone's face or threatening to put someone in the ground. That was rookie behavior. He moved in a different league. He didn't make threats, he made suggestions, gentle ones, and those suggestions weren't ignored because even the suggestion carried weight. When he asked for something, it wasn't really a request. It was a direction wrapped in velvet, the kind of thing that made you feel like you had a choice even when you didn't. That was the art of influence. Not brute force but elegance, not chaos but quiet control. He didn't need a gun on the table. He didn't need a crowd of soldiers around him to prove he was untouchable. You never really saw him with bodyguards. And that was what made people more nervous, because if someone like him didn't walk around paranoid, it meant he knew no one dared. That was the fear he built, not loud, not flashy, but deep, lasting, psychological. People feared disappointing him more than they feared death. That's real influence, making people want to please you before you even speak. He knew every angle. He wasn't just thinking about today or next week. He played chess while everyone else was fumbling with checkers. He'd sit across from judges, mayors, CEO, and not one of them would leave the room without offering something, a favor, a tip, a leak. Some of them didn't even know why they were helping him, they just did. That's the kind of gravity he had. He didn't ask you to sell your soul. He just convinced you that it was already his, and he never flaunted it. That's where the secrecy came in, the second half of his power. See, he understood that the more people knew, the more exposed you became, the more you showed, the easier you were to hit. So he stayed in the shadows, always 2 steps removed. He wasn't the one signing the deals. He wasn't the one collecting the envelopes. He wasn't the one barking orders. He created buffers, men who owed him, men who feared him, men who would take the fall. That way, if something ever went sideways, his name never made it into the paperwork. No paper trail, no witnesses, no evidence, just silence. He never used phones, he never wrote anything down. Meetings were rare, and when they happened, you left your ego at the door. If you showed up with too much pride or too much noise, you weren't invited back. If you disrespected the sanctity of discretion, you disappeared. That was the unwritten code. You kept your mouth shut, or someone shut it for you. Not out of anger, but out of necessity, because secrecy was sacred. It was what kept the machine running. You couldn't have rats, you couldn't have leaks. One loose tongue could collapse a decade of work. So he built a culture where silence was loyalty, and loyalty was everything. Even his closest people didn't know the full scope of his empire. That was intentional. He gave each man just enough information to do his job, no more. That way, if someone flipped, they couldn't burn the whole house down just a room or two. He compartmentalized power, turned his operation into a fortress of shadows, and the genius of it all, most people didn't even know they were part of it. To the outside world, he was just a businessman, a quiet guy, maybe a little mysterious, but never dangerous. That's the level of secrecy we're talking about. He wore invisibility like a tailored suit. And yet his influence never wavered. That's the thing. You'd think someone who avoided the spotlight would fade into irrelevance. Not him, because his moves spoke louder than any press conference. He didn't need to be seen to be felt. Politicians owed him elections. Developers couldn't build without his approval. Law enforcement turned a blind eye, not out of corruption, but out of survival. You crossed him, you paid for it. Maybe not today. Maybe not tomorrow, but eventually and permanently, and that was the most terrifying part, the patience. He didn't act out of emotion, he calculated, he waited, and when he struck, it was final. He wasn't interested in bloodshed for the sake of it. He believed in violence only when it had purpose. Precision hits, not messy, not loud, not public, just efficient. The guy who crossed him, maybe he disappeared, maybe he had an accident. Maybe he got indicted for something he didn't even do. But he never connected it back to the Quiet Godfather. That's how good he was. You didn't even know you were being taught a lesson until the class was already over. Some people said he had no soul. Others said he had too much of one, just buried beneath layers of strategy. But whatever he wasn't ordinary. He saw the world like a puzzle. People were pieces. You moved them around until the picture made sense. And if a piece didn't fit, you didn't force it, you replaced it. That was the difference between him and the amateurs. He didn't try to bend the world, he adjusted to it. And then, slowly, he reshaped it from the inside out. He wasn't greedy, not in the traditional sense. He didn't chase money for the sake of excess. He understood that real power didn't come from what you had, it came from what others thought you could take from them. That's why fear worked better than wealth. A man who's afraid of losing something will give you everything. A man who's greedy, he just keeps asking. But the Godfather, he let people offer, and they did, over and over again, because pleasing him meant protection. Disappointing him meant ruin, and there were no second chances. His legacy wasn't built on headlines or history books. It was built on whispered stories, cautionary tales, rules passed down through generations. Don't ask questions, don't get loud, don't make him remember your name for the wrong reason. Those weren't just sayings, they were survival guides. He became legend by becoming invisible, a myth that breathed. A shadow with teeth. Some tried to copy his style, but they missed the point. They thought being quiet meant being passive. No, it meant being in control of yourself, your surroundings, your enemies. It meant knowing when to strike and when to disappear. It meant being patient, being disciplined. Most men couldn't handle that. They wanted quick wins, fast money, loud power, and that's why they always fell. He, on the other hand, endured. He outlived the loud ones. The ones who danced in clubs, who flaunted their cars, who posted photos with stacks of cash. They burned fast and bright, and then they burned out. But he was the ember that never died, always warm, always there, quiet, constant, eternal. He understood that noise fades, but silence, that lingers, silence crawls into the back of your mind and stays there. Long after the gunshots fade, long after the sirens stop, long after the headlines change, the silence remains, and in that silence you hear him, still watching, still waiting, still pulling the strings. That was the Quiet Godfather, a man of influence, a master of secrecy, the kind of figure you never forget even if you never saw him coming.